My name is Roddy. I'm with the Denver Communists. I use they, them pronouns. And today we're going to talk about state capitalism. My presentation is a bit of a misnomer. Two of the theories we're going to go over tonight are not state capitalists, but are essential to know to understand Tony Cliff's theory of state capitalism. My sources, the primary one I use is Tony Cliff and the Theory of State Capitalism in Russia, which was a presentation given by Ben Hillier for I think it's the Marxist Conference of 2010. And then I also used some bits from the Theory of State Capitalism by Peter Binns and an interview from Tony Cliff in the ISR review of 1997. So some context for what these theories emerged from. The Russian Revolution destroyed the bourgeoisie class within Russia and smashed the state, allowing for the formation of a new workers' state. However, under Stalin and the bureaucracy, the workers' control was stripped away. The trade unions became part of the mechanism to exploit the working class. Bolsheviks were imprisoned, exiled, and murdered. Strikes were prohibited, and abortion and homosexuality were criminalized. Hiller also mentions that the Soviets were disbanded. I looked into that myself. I couldn't find a source for that. From what I understand, they were brought into the Supreme Soviet in the second Constitution of 1936. So I'd love if somebody with a better understanding of history could elaborate for us, maybe in the discussion section. So as far as Trotsky's analysis of the USSR, Trotsky was, he was the critic, right, of the USSR and its degeneration. But essentially, he still believed it was a worker state and a step forward for society. And as somebody who's come to this party from the IMT, this is a position that I had held as an Orthodox Trotskyist until recently. And so Trotsky commented on the dual nature of the USSR. Part of its nature, part of its dialectical nature is the socialist nature. The USSR was a network of institutions that had expropriated economic and political power from the bourgeoisie and placed industry in the hands of the worker, although Trotsky will qualify how it's put into the hands of the worker later in a way that might not satisfy some of us. And so as far as their bourgeoisie nature, the USSR was not an industrially developed country after its revolution, and thus could not produce enough goods to meet demand. Therefore, the state had to play some kind of role in distributing, the products in accordance with bourgeois norms. And this is inevitably going to lead to a bureaucratic strata above the working class to designate how these goods are going to be distributed. And this occurred because, Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution did not happen. So the German Revolution didn't happen, the Chinese Revolution didn't happen, and they didn't have access to more advanced economies to produce the goods that were needed at home, which, led to lines, shortages, etc. So as long as there is scarcity, there will be bureaucracy, and there's going to be a distortion of the worker state, to say the very least, if you agree that it is a worker state, if you agree with Trotsky. So Trotsky's argument against qualifying the USSR as state capitalist, he argued that the bureaucracy did not constitute a new ruling class because it did not establish any new forms of property. It maintained the existing state ownership won by the revolution, so the state ownership of property. And ownership is the primary focus in Trotsky's analysis of USSR society. He is not as concerned with the relationship of production as, say, Cliff will later see is. So the character of the social regime is determined first by property relations. State ownership of the means of production constitutes the basis of social order in the USSR and thus establishes the USSR as a worker state. Since the bureaucracy did not have formal ownership of the means of production, Trotsky did not view them as a class unto themselves. And Trotsky argues since no one has ownership, thus everyone has ownership. The loss of political power and social power of the workers is not necessarily relevant in Trotsky's analysis. The working class is in control of the USSR because the state controls the means of production. That's his assertion. Trotsky did not view the bureaucracy as a class unto itself, but rather a caste of the working class. A caste being a group that's either constituted from multiple classes or, in this instance, an element of a single class. And Trotsky had previously asserted that a worker state would give the worker the instruments of power necessary to discipline the bureaucracy and assert themselves over society. So obviously he's contradicting himself with this, later analysis. Trotsky also argued that the bureaucracy was caught in the tension between the workers and the possibility of capitalist restoration. To the extent that the regime develops productive forces, it is preparing the economic basis for socialism, and to the extent that it develops the bourgeois distribution, it is preparing for capitalist restoration. So he viewed the USSR as a pyramid standing on its head, able to be pushed towards socialism or towards capitalism. So he viewed the revolution as being betrayed. Trotsky believed that the revolution had not been defeated, but rather betrayed by a layer of the Communist Party that had fused with the state bureaucracy, seeking to pursue their own interests. And for Trotsky, the problem with the USSR was a political one, not an economic or societal one. The bourgeoisie had been expropriated, industry was centralized and in the hands of what he considered to be a degenerated worker state, and the bureaucracy had developed to run the state apparatus through the suppression of democracy, the suppression of the instruments of workers' power, and also through censorship and the suppression of criticism, which is also, very key. So workers have lost political power, but the fundamental gains of the revolution remain, which was collectivized property in Trotsky's view. If Trotsky said if there was a capitalist restoration, it would need to smash the Soviet state. It would have to destroy state ownership to succeed. So Trotsky's position on the task of the workers: if the workers had to engage in another revolution, what would be the task? The state already controls the means of production, so the revolution would be of a political nature, reasserting workers' power over control of the state via Soviet power. Trotsky did not see a need for another social revolution. So this brings us to Max Shachtman, who is a Polish-born Marxist theorist, and he said that Trotsky was correct to assert that the USSR was neither socialist or capitalist, but was wrong to assert that it was not a new class society. And he argued that the USSR did not show the distinctive characteristics of capitalism, like competition had been eliminated, the state controlled the means of productions, commodity production, meaning production of goods for a market, had been eliminated, and the law of value as he saw it had ceased to operate. So Shachtman said that the Russian Revolution began the process of fusing economic and political power in the working class. And the fusion of this economic and political power in the hands of the state led Shachtman to argue that Trotsky had the problem confused and upside down. Political power, not economic power, so not state control of the means of production, was the primary determinant of social power within the USSR. So when the state is in control of the means of production, the economy is subject to the conscious control of those who are in control of the state. In this sense, politics determines economics. Therefore, the working class can only achieve economic supremacy through political supremacy. Shachtman asserts that the revolution's defeat would occur not in the changing of property forms, as Trotsky theorized, but with the working class losing control over the property itself. A worker state will only manifest when the working class has agency. And I think we can all agree, we see this in Stalin's USSR. Like, the working class was not in control of what they produced, how much they produced, etc. That was in control of the bureaucracy. So Shachtman continues. He claims that Trotsky confuses property forms with property relations, which we had just mentioned. Property in the hands of the state is not controlled by the whole of society, but those who control the state. And therefore, a ruling class is still expressed in this relationship. The bureaucracy stands above the worker and controls their production, also, controls their consumption through scarcity, etc. Shachtman agrees with Trotsky that the new class is not a capitalist class. Both assert a counter-revolution that privatizes property would be necessary for a capitalist counter-revolution. So this brings us to Tony Cliff and his theory of state capital, which, now having read all this, I find pretty compelling. Cliff's analysis emerges as a post-World War II analysis, where the Soviet Union controls portions of Europe. This allows him to examine the theoretical contradictions in the expansion of the USSR. So, how should states that did not experience a workers' revolution but are controlled by the USSR via its expansion after World War II be viewed? If they're identical to the USSR, which is a workers' state, they must somehow also be transformed into a workers' state without revolution. But this would contradict Marx's theory that workers must liberate themselves. So Cliff continued. Cliff asserts that Shachtman's position of the USSR as a collectivist bureaucratic state is an arbitrary position because Shachtman puts forward no positive construction as to how a society operates in that formation. So if the USSR is a new form of society, then Marxism couldn't offer perspective, as it is a theory of working class revolution. Under Shachtman's formation, the working class were akin to slaves and could not be said to exist in the same sense that workers exist in a capitalist formation. So Cliff argues that both Trotsky and Shachtman make the same mistake of property forms for property relations. And it is more important to analyze the relationships of production than the relationship of ownership when determining the class characteristics of a society. And the example he gives is church-owned land in feudal society was worked by peasants. In this sense, the church could be said to be feudal, even though individual clergy, so individual priests, did not own the land. So Cliff continued, the USSR is comprised of class relations. A minority controlled the production apparatus of society, the bureaucracy, that the strata, as Trotsky referred to them, and a majority labored with no control over the productive apparatus or the products of their labor, which Marx was very clear leads to alienation. So Cliff rejects Shachtman's assertion that the USSR does not have capitalist characteristics. He states that in a global context, it could be said that the state functions in the way a private enterprise would, and the bureaucracy would be functioning like the management of that company. So while competition did not exist internally for the USSR, it was externally enforced through the international economy, forcing the USSR to compete with developed capitalist economies, such as the US. So concluding on Tony Cliff's thoughts here, the fundamental feature of capitalism is not private ownership, but capital accumulation, which we do see in the USSR. The most advanced capitalist economy is, and just to explain why Cliff believes this, he points out that the most advanced capitalist economies lost qualities like free competition, distribution via price mechanisms, and the freedom of labor during World War II in order to fight the wars, yet this did not qualitatively change the economy away from being a capitalist formation. Rather, the competition shifted from being an economic capitalist competition to a military one. And this echoes Bachran's sentiments on capitalism in World War I. So Cliff points out that consumption in the USSR is subordinated to the expansion of industry to meet the external coercion of capital. And thus the bureaucracy becomes the ruling class through the fusion of political and economic power. Capital restoration occurs without the state being smashed by divorcing the worker from state political power, and the relationship of the worker to the state becomes one of worker to owner, qualitatively changing the society to a state capitalist form. The state is responsible for the direction of industry and development, and all industrial development is required for the continued existence of the state and the reproduction of the bureaucratic class. For the USSR, which would be unable to compete economically with the capitalist developed economies, this meant competing militarily. Only through the USSR's strong military could it defend its monopoly on industry and trade through its territories, and the Cold War was a military competition between two ruling classes rather than two competing social formations. While the Cold War was necessary for the bureaucracy to maintain its power, fundamentally it was also the source of its demise.